On today's edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, we are going to be looking back at what we spoke about the Florida Panthers' organizational philosophy during the offseason versus how it's resulting now, and the shakeup, of course, with the personnel. We are also going to be talking about the chances of the Panthers being part of a Winter Classic game or stadium series, and we're going to continue to focus on the Arizona Coyotes. We're going to discuss that more here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
Your Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
And welcome into this Tuesday, January 3rd edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez. You can follow me on Twitter at MondoMan12. Follow the show account on Twitter at LO_FLA Panthers. Don't forget to also subscribe to the other shows on the Locked On NHL Network, including Locked On NHL, Locked On Fantasy Hockey with Flip Livingstone and Steele Roden. And you can listen to Heidi Calacash to cover everything World Juniors related at Locked On NHL Prospects. And don't forget to also submit your subscription to the Locked On Florida Panthers YouTube channel by sending in your screenshot of that and a 5-star rating on whichever podcast app you listen to Locked On Panthers for your chance to win 2 free tickets to the Florida Panthers versus Vancouver Canucks game on January 14th. So good luck, everybody. So I've had a lot to think about with just the direction of this team. And when you talk about everything that's gone wrong with the offense generating early, defense not being the problem in the beginning, then once the offense started scoring goals, they were getting some power play opportunities. Sam Reinhart was starting to get going later on the season. Then the defensive woes started showing up. The goaltenders being so up and down as they are, which now both Sergei Bobrovsky and Spencer Knight are both at GAAs of 3 on the season for both of them. And just talking about and thinking about just how everything is put in place and just the organizational philosophy that Bill Zito specifically went into this offseason. We on the outside, of course, spoke about this was a step back season for the Panthers. We're living through it. They still expect to win. We still expected them to be in at least the wild card race or even top 3 in the division, 3rd spot mostly. A lot of national writers or national broadcasters as well. Butchercross did not have the Panthers making the postseason. Steve Levy had the Florida Panthers as the Stanley Cup champions. And this was one of the hardest teams as well to put your finger on. And even for myself, this was a hard team to put your finger on. And the Boston Bruins are another one, too, right before the season. Because of the success that the Panthers had with 58 wins, franchise record, only 18 regulation losses with the Panthers. With now the Panthers have 18 regulation losses this season, tied the amount of all of last season. You kind of wonder when it comes to the coaching hire about what was the thought process of Paul Maurice. And listen, I was warming up to the idea of Paul Maurice. It's documented from the summer. We had a Winans Wednesday edition of that show where Jacob and I were like being more warm to the idea of Paul Maurice being the coach because the experience factor. But then you start to think about why he's lasted so long at his stops too. And the conclusion I'm just trying to not come up with, but to think about why, is maybe an ability to finesse. And because he's so process oriented as a person, and how he talks about the game, about listen, after the Panthers practiced on Monday, he spoke about how the Panthers didn't give up many even strength shots. He said 9 the rest of the way after the first 5 minutes on Sunday against the Rangers, where there was 11 shots on goal between even strength and power play. And talking about how certain players were starting to generate chances, high danger. Spoke mostly about Brandon Montour. But there's also the transition game's completely gone, or for the most part gone. And with Anthony Duclair looking to return, how much will he fit into this? Because as far as the Panthers trapping stuff in the neutral zone and generating speed, they've struggled. And again, I have a zero expectations approach with Anthony Duclair coming off an Achilles injury. The ability for you to get your first step. And again, going back to Maurice, process oriented, at least from what we hear. And just the ability to finesse. And listen, Bill Zito, I was in the press box last season at Amalie Arena and seeing him chat with other people. He's very passionate when he talks, period. He's always moving his hands a lot too, and just very animated. He's a very animated person, even with the cameras off. I was not listening into the conversation. I was a little far away, but I did see him about how animated he was. And I believe that's really more of what his persona is. I mean, when the Matthew Tkachuk trade happened, he was very passionate about it. But what about Paul Maurice? About talking about how he likes certain things about the Panthers' game, despite loss after loss after loss. And then Bill Zito in the offseason, even rewinding to months ago, talking about how the very first time that he spoke on the phone with Paul Maurice during the interview process is that conversation lasting 10 hours. And I thought about this more because my Wednesday guest host, Jake Winans, he posted out a tweet shortly after the loss to the New York Rangers. And this is what it says, quote, Bill Zito is a good GM, but he is inexperienced. Paul Maurice is a bad coach, but he is very experienced. It's become clear that the experienced man knows how to give a great interview and knew all the right things to say to inexperienced Zito. He got a job and he should not have. Close quote. I don't believe the tweet 100% with Jacob. Don't agree with every single thing he said about him being a bad coach. I don't think Paul Maurice is a bad coach. I do think that Paul Maurice for this franchise was dealt a pretty hard hand. But there's a reason why his message got old in multiple places. Let's realize that. The team that he got fired from in 2006, the Carolina Hurricanes, they won the Stanley Cup that same season under Peter Laviolette. Couldn't get the best out of a group. But he knew how to sweet talk people, and even myself too. I'm a victim of that too, because during the offseason he was saying all the right things. Of course, there's so much energy as well with this Panthers team coming off 122 points, President's Trophy, first round series win for the first time in 26 years. Whether Brunette should have had a chance or not. Then here comes the interview process, and here comes a guy who knows how to talk to GMs and knows how, been there, done that. And knowing how to, and whenever it comes to an interview, if the person is getting interviewed fires back with a lot of questions to the person originally doing the interview, you're doing it right. And chances are that's what Paul Maurice did during his interview. he always referred it back to, I would do this. What would you probably do? This and ask him questions to make him think a little bit more about things that he saw when he wasn't the coach just yet. And also when you're a GM and you're just focusing on your team, you only see so much from a certain lens. But when someone on the outside comes and observes your team, the observations and that Bill Zito probably received were like, I probably never thought of it that way. And that's what comes with the experience of Paul Maurice as a coach, and gave him that ability to finesse Bill Zito, the inexperienced guy. And this is where Jacob's tweet about Paul Maurice kind of makes sense, with bringing in the coach and with a guy who's only in his third year being the GM of this team. And listen, Bill Zito brought the Panthers from middle of the pack to Stanley Cup contender to, as of right now, back to the middle of the pack. Still think the long term for the Panthers, as far as cap, youth, is in good hands. But depending on how far you miss the postseason and banking on the cap room to make something happen, there will be very little margin for error next season for this Cats team. And that's a scary place to be. Which right now, you'll need at least 2/3 of the points the rest of the way to play 700 hockey. We're almost literally at the halfway point. 38 games played, 36 points. And you don't listen, the expectations will be gone of Stanley Cup contender next season. But the expectation, the first 5 games of next season, if you get off to a bad start, those fire Maurice chants from the fans will be even louder. And I don't agree with the fire Maurice chants now. I do think this is a 2-season minimum experiment for the Panthers, unless they really fall early. And we also got to think about that there was a shakeup really in the locker room too, and how much is that received well too. And let's talk about more of that, the shakeup, and just about how the players are receiving each other too. Let's talk about that in segment number 2. But first, we're going to tell you all about BetOnline. And BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get all the latest odds, trends, in every professional amateur league out there, from pro football, college bowl season, to basketball and hockey. We've got it all at BetOnline. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and easiest way to get your sports betting info. Head to the website today or use a mobile device to learn more. BetOnline is where the game starts. Back on this second segment here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast on this Tuesday, January 3rd edition of the show. And Paul Maurice is it's easy to point the finger at him. But let's not forget also the guy that hired him too. And just the shakeup of a 115-point score on Jonathan Huberdeau, bringing in Matthew Tkachuk. But it's not just to play on the ice. Matthew Tkachuk individually is a treat. Having a great individual season. There's so many individual seasons that are on the Panthers that you could point to and say, hey, this guy's playing well, but the cohesion. Let's talk about the cohesion. And leadership too. Of course, long term, the goal is to build both around Tkachuk, and Barkov. Those two. Those are likely just the two untouchables even going into this offseason. Whether you are able to move an Ekblad and a Bobrovsky right now, and during the offseason, very unlikely. But we know what's being built. What you're at least what you're supposed to build around. But you also got to ask yourselves, and this is what I ask myself as well, how much of that behind the scenes chemistry is there? It was a lot easier for the message to be received with Huberdeau around. Of course, he had been with the organization for 10 plus years, was part of a playoff series 4 or 5 years ago. Well, actually, that's 2016 was 7 years ago. Hard to believe. But the fact that older veteran, at least if he was still on the team, he'd be that older veteran who had been around the block versus Tkachuk, who recently was coming off a pretty poor second round series against the Edmonton Oilers, to put it nicely, despite getting 104 points, being a 40 goal scorer. But also to think about him and his desire to not be in Calgary. If he was going to sign a 1-year deal and become a UFA and then choose his destination, Calgary didn't want any of that. They wanted to get the biggest return possible. And his desire to not want to be there changes so many people's lives too. And it's not to say that it was a bad trade. I still don't think it's a bad trade. But you also just got to think about a 24-year-old kid still. He's still a kid. Very young. And we love the attitude. We love him being in front of the net and pissing people off. We love it as fans. And of course, the attitude that he brings to the team. But how is that received with the other guys, with the new guy being in town and coming in and doing all that? And the cohesion with everything. The Flash is great. He's leading the team with points too. This is the first time I've said this on the show, but him having the mouthpiece chewed up as a fishhook is like Stephen Curry in the NBA. You always see Stephen Curry have that mouthpiece fishhooked on him, especially when he's taking a free throw. Matthew Tkachuk, all the time you see that. And it does bring a little bit of an intimidation factor to the opposition. But as far as like working together with your teammates, how much of that is there behind the scenes? And yeah, you're not going to be liked by everybody. You're just not going to. That's the truth. You don't have to like your teammates. You just don't. And this is no reporting. This is just trying to think about why this team hasn't just put it together. And the fact that it's something new with a new player coming in, he is a unicorn in my opinion, and Bill Zito's opinion as well. He's a rare find. But how much of that grittiness that we've all been hyping up with all offseason, which the hype is very much there and valid, how is that received in the locker room versus how they talk to each other and how they discuss just philosophies of when they do hit the ice? With Huberdeau, of course, we spoke about this in the short term. They probably would have had a better record this year. But again, how that contract age is consistently a question that I'm gonna ask myself. And as of right now, there's neither of the teams are looking like they're gonna win this trade. I haven't looked at Calgary's record recently, but they were out of the playoffs last time I checked. They're third in the Pacific, just two above the wild card in the Pacific, but 1 point ahead of Seattle, and Seattle has 3 games in hand. So that's a trade on the national level that really hasn't been spoken about recently, of who's going to win the trade, who's going to lose the trade. But we also got to think about how is he received as well. It's just something to just think about. Me as a person who watches this game, as a fan, not always being around the room, which I will be around tomorrow, as I will be attending morning skate and then covering Panthers Coyotes from the press box tomorrow. I will be in person, and I want to see. I want to get more of what the vibe is whenever I do hear the team talk, because there's only so much that you could feel on TV. But I do want to get that feeling of like what and how it's received when in the actual setting. And that's something that I'm going to approach with tomorrow. And like I said, your brain doesn't even fully develop until you're 25 too. Maybe for some people, maybe even later. So I'm not saying that Tkachuk has to calm it down by any stretch of the imagination. Maybe when he does get in front of the blue paint and on the doorstep about hacking at goalies. Of course, we saw that with him and Jonathan Quick back in November. Just maybe that, at least on the ice. But I can't necessarily say he has to tone it back behind the scenes or anything, because I don't know how it's received. And they're not going to throw him under the bus. But it's just something to ask yourself. How is it received? How is he coming across to his teammates? We like it. But do his teammates like it? Did they like just the quiet leader in Barkov? And to a certain extent, Huberdeau? Huberdeau has plenty of personality. But he's, as far as being animated, of course, it doesn't compare to Tkachuk. Did the players see that as he came in, that they got a little bit of a bad vibe? I don't know. But it's something just to continue to ask ourselves. In segment number 3, we are going to be discussing the possibility of the Florida Panthers being part of a Stadium Series / Winter Classic game, and we're going to continue having an eye on the Arizona Coyotes. We're going to discuss that next here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
Your Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Third and final segment here on this Tuesday, January 3rd edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. And this is one of the coolest days in sports, just with the Rose Bowl game going on, which is currently going on as I'm recording this at 6:53 p.m. on a Monday night. The Winter Classic, of course, many college football games, and of course the NHL schedule, which thankfully the Winter Classic had its own time slot, and Fenway Park hosting it. And listen, I've been to Fenway Park once for a baseball game back in 2016. Sat in right field. It's an obstructed view for a baseball game. I can't even imagine a Winter Classic game. And personally, for Fenway Park, really the fact that it's Fenway Park is the fact that they got that game, but the views are just really, really obstructive. And I personally don't think it makes for a good experience as far as being able to see the game. But of course, watch it on TV. Low scoring game. Jake DeBrusk scores 2 goals in the last period, which still the Boston Bruins still haven't lost the regulation game at home. And how funny would it have been if their first regulation loss came in the Winter Classic at Fenway Park? But that didn't happen, so whatever. But only 3 teams have still yet to play in the Winter Classic or a Stadium Series game, an outdoor game. Those are the Florida Panthers, Columbus Blue Jackets, and Arizona Coyotes. The Florida Panthers and the Coyotes are not surprising. Columbus is a little surprising, not going to lie. I don't know. Maybe you could get them to play in Ohio State Stadium and have them play against Detroit or Chicago even. It'll have to be a big market team as the road team as far as being able to market the event as well. And the NHL always looks at what is going to get the most eyeballs. And this year was that year to do it, honestly, with the Florida Panthers coming off a President's Trophy season. Carolina Hurricanes are hosting a Stadium Series game next month. And I was thinking, please let it be the Panthers. Please let it be the Panthers. Unfortunately, no, it's going to be the Washington Capitals. And Ovechkin's pretty marketable. And with the season that the Panthers are having, don't bet on the Panthers having an outdoor game next year. The Heritage Classic is going to be a Battle of Alberta in October. That's going to be fun. Winter Classic next year is going to be Vegas versus Seattle, the 2 expansion teams at T-Mobile Park where the Seattle Mariners play. That's going to be pretty awesome, not going to lie. But what are the chances of the Panthers ever do an outdoor game? Number 1, they'd have to win multiple playoff series. Number 2, it'd have to be a road game. And even the Tampa Bay Lightning, who have won 2 cups in the last 3 years, even their outdoor game, they had to be on the road for theirs. Weather is a factor, too. So the cards, as far as the Winter Classic, are stacked against the Panthers. When it comes to an outdoor game, it's even stacked up against their rival up in the Gulf Coast. Because you're taking a risk hosting at Raymond James if the Bolts ever had a game, because of the ice possibly melting. It'd have to be at night, of course. They're not going to do it during the daytime in Florida. And let's be real, the Tropicana Field, dump. Even though that's their old venue and it's fully domed, so it defeats the purpose of an outdoor game. The Panthers, you would be taking a big risk if you had held at Hard Rock Stadium. And if they do ever host, you'd have to try to do it at Marlins Park. Well, Lone Depot Park. And have the option to close the roof if the ice melts in a primetime slot. It has to be a primetime slot. But then even with the closed roof, that defeats the purpose of an outdoor game. It's supposed to be an outdoor game. So I can only really talk about it from the Panthers' perspective of things. Geographically, the NHL is already, as far as compared to the 4 major sports, the lowest revenue generating league in North America of the four major ones. It takes a lot of money to put a rink together, an event together, to market it, to get the local sponsors as well, national sponsors. How much are they willing to risk bringing it to Marlins Park? And again, you have to be relevant for multiple seasons. That's really the reason why Tampa Bay got theirs. They've won. So the Panthers would have to be on the road if they do. I would love more than I would have loved that Florida Panthers Carolina Hurricanes Stadium Series game. I would have loved everything about that. It's former division rivals too, from the Southeast Division, and then that one season in the Central Division during the 56-game season. Or even Nashville, like at Nissan Stadium where the Titans play. That would be another one. I don't know what if the Panthers would do Panthers versus Blue Jackets in a Stadium Series game, because again, they're trying to market this league and market the players. Of course, Barkov and Patrick Laine, two Finns who are great friends, and of course, people in Finland would watch. But franchise success has a lot to do with it too. So it seems as if the cards are a little bit stacked against the Panthers as far as an outdoor game. And I'm not counting on one. If you win more, then we could start thinking about one and we could start mentally preparing. But don't expect one, Panther fans. Panthers play the Arizona Coyotes tonight. Like I said, I'll be there in person. And it's going to be my first game in person since opening night against the Philadelphia Flyers. And again, like we spoke about with Alex Slump of Full Press NHL, this Coyotes team is not one. They're not as much of a doormat as they were last season. And they started off fast, even recently when they were in Tampa Bay, got off to a 2-0 lead on the road against Tampa Bay. And remember, comeback cats isn't a thing this year. It's just not the way this team is built and the way this team is coached. So you really, really got to make sure that they don't score early. And with the last matchup, doubling the amount of shots as well, that last one was just as frustrating as a loss as can be. Krover-Melko was awesome. Colin White had the only goal in that game. Shots on goal, 42-21. And Arizona has even defeated Toronto twice. And there's a stat actually about a consecutive streak of the Arizona Coyotes going into Toronto and getting at least a point. I don't know what that number is, but it's a big streak. It's like over 10 games. So this is not an easy game for the Panthers by any stretch of the imagination. And the Arizona Coyotes have also beaten the Boston Bruins too, at home too. They played a lot more road games, of course, with their arena situation. They went the full month of November, mostly, not being at home. So they've gotten used to being on the road this season. And that team has every reason to be tired, but they're not making that excuse. Bill Armstrong's come out and said that it's brought a little bit of an excitement that these guys have been able to be together and get along, and they're playing for each other. And they're still going to trade Jakob Chychrun sometime. Of course, they're still waiting for the right package. Of course, he's returned, and of course, GMs are very hesitant to trade for him right now because of his injury history. And this is something that Elliot Friedman keeps bringing up on 32 Thoughts that I kind of roll my eyes every single time I hear it. And he says that if the Panthers had the draft capital to make a trade for Jakob Chychrun, they would have done it by now. But they don't have that. So even entertaining anything in relation to that of bringing the South Florida kid back home is just a waste of energy, honestly. We're gonna enjoy this guy and his homecoming and all that stuff, but as far as the possibility for him to come over to Sunrise, it's just not in the cards. Especially with the trade deadline that they had last year, you erase that possibility completely. With pulling that off, and the direction of like I've spoken about many times, with the flat cap in these last 2-3 seasons, sellers can manipulate the hell out of buyers to give their first round picks, which GMs are very hesitant to, because this upcoming draft is considered a very strong draft. So Panthers won't be able to add because of where they are and the amount of LTIR money that they have committed to. But we don't even know where they're going to even subtract if this trend continues to go on. I mean, even if they win, even if they go on their first 3-game winning streak in these next 3 games, which will bring them at 41 games and 42 points on the season, and they have a pace of the first half of the first half of the season into the second half, you'll finish with 84 points on the season. And you'll be out of the playoffs by more than 10 points, more than likely. And that's even with ending the first half as far as the amount of games on a 3-game winning streak. Not a place you want to be. Very hard place to be. And right now, for the Florida Panthers, we are in reevaluation mode. Every single game, where is the direction? How do we forecast what this team is going to do at the trade deadline and the offseason? And we'll know more once this month ends, that's for sure. But we have to ask ourselves, was December the month that really ended the Panthers season? And that's a podcast episode for another day. And I guess that will change more whether they win or lose, depending on what kind of streak they go on, whether it's a losing streak or a winning streak. We'll evaluate then. And at least that thought. But of course, we're consistently reevaluating this team right now. And you just got to start by winning one. It's 82 one-game seasons, as Jeff Merrick of Sportsnet says. So just focus on this 1-game season on Tuesday. And it's a team that, on paper, you should. But the Arizona Coyotes are not a doormat that you can just run over, especially after the teams that I listed that they've defeated. So on tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, it'll be a Winans Wednesday edition of the show. We'll be breaking down the Florida Panthers matchup versus the Arizona Coyotes. And we'll be discussing then whether it could be a step in the right direction of a team that they should beat, or will this be another loss against a team you should beat? We'll find out. We'll find out tomorrow, and lots of questions to be answered if the latter is the case. But in the meantime, if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast to be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Make sure to subscribe to the other shows on the Locked On NHL network, including Locked On NHL and Locked On Fantasy Hockey with Flip Livingstone and Stu Roden. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. And for your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On NHL Prospects, your daily podcast covering the next generation of hockey superstars leading up to the NHL draft. Locked On NHL Prospects is available on YouTube, Odyssey, and wherever you get podcasts. So I'm Armando Velez, signing off. And you've been listening to Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We're your team every day.